We welcome you to this class on Joshua, Judges, and Ruth here at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. And we are ready today for the ninth lesson, which is going to be dealing with Samson the entirety of today in Judges 13 through 16. The next 2 weeks are really R-rated, so just be aware of that. They're really terrible stories that close out the book of Judges. So, you know, if that titillates you, you want to read chapter 17 through.
So you don't want us to miss any classes for the next couple of weeks.
Just warning you. That's all I'm really doing. Just warning you. You might think, how can it be any worse than what we're getting ready to look at? But one of the things that has amazed me in this particular study, and you know, it makes me think, did you really ever read these books when you were I thought I did, but when you study something, gosh, you just learn it in ways that you didn't before, and that has been, at least for me, the case. Whether I've been able to share any of that with you through Joshua and Judges, for me it's been kind of eye-opening to read through these books. Well, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. God, time and time again, your Spirit stirred inside your chosen deliverers, coming on them in great power, enabling them to become unrestrainable forces that accomplished your will. When you stir inside us and come on us in great power, do we respond in ways that please you? Do we draw the attention of others to you? Because your people repeatedly set aside your life-giving law to embrace instead the customs and values and beliefs of other gods, you must yet be a divine man of sorrows, too acquainted with grief. We know ourselves well enough to know how often we too fail to heed your Spirit. What we don't know is what it would yet take for that to change. But God, we're ready to learn and willing. Amen. Well, all right. So jump straight in now to chapter 13, where we begin to be introduced to this character, Samson. Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, the last now of the major judges is Samson. And it has been a descending, increasingly getting worse route as we have worked our way through. So we have now reached the bottom of the pot when we have gotten to Samson. It probably should therefore come as no surprise as we start off this story on Samson to realize that the Hebrews are once again doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. It's unspecified as to what exactly they are doing, but they are once again doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so, as chapter 13 opens up, God does not deliver the Hebrews from oppression. God, it seems, has just thrown up God's hands. And it says God delivers the Hebrews to oppression. You don't want to go there. We want deliverance from. We don't want deliverance to. The intriguing thing, though, is the Philistines. We tend to, I think, kind of have a bad idea about the Philistines because it's from the Philistines that this character Goliath comes, you know, that David will be in battle with. And so we just tend to think, I think, that the Philistines are a warlike people that really terribly oppress the Hebrews in the land of Canaan, the promised land. But that's really not true. The Philistines were not so much a warlike people that just, you know, were sort of demagogues that beat up on everybody around them. That's not at all what the Hebrews are facing in terms of so-called oppression from the Philistines. I'm going to go into a little bit more of this in just a moment, but the oppression that they're facing from the Hebrews is more of a lifestyle kind of oppression. The sort of thing where the Philistines influence the Hebrews along certain ways in terms of lifestyle or morality or the truths of their culture that were then bought into by the Hebrews. And this ends up being the worst oppression possible that the Hebrews are going to face. A dominant culture that effectively gets them to set aside what we would say is their Jewishness, their Hebraic nature that they have received from God. They set aside God's law for what they can receive from the Philistines. And as I said, I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a bit. Philistines have 5 major cities that are typically referred to not in the northern part of what we would call Israel, but in the southern part, down where Judah is, which is why we're going to be dealing with them in this particular area, because Samson, when he's born, he's a Danite. So it's kind of west of Jerusalem. If you can kind of mentally picture a map, it's west of Jerusalem, moving over toward the coast, and that's where the Philistines tended to settle, was on what we would consider sort of the west side of Israel, or the eastern coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. They will end up oppressing the Hebrews for 40 years, for an entire generation. If you read books on them, if you read something or other about Samson, you may find people, so-called biblical scholars, telling you that it's quite possible, in fact, it's quite probable that Samson is a contemporary of Samuel. And the connection that they are making, of which there's really no proof except for a word, they make the connection and say it must be about the same time, because during Samuel's lifetime, the Philistines were causing problems. And you remember that when David's a young man, he battles against Goliath. But it's because the Philistines are important at the time of Samuel, as well as being important at the time of Samson, that they say, aha, they must have been contemporaries. Well, maybe they were. But there's nothing other than simply the same oppressor that makes that connection. So if that sounds good to you, run with it. If it doesn't, say, yeah, once again. Okay, jumping into the text now. The very first thing that we hear about Samson's parents, before Samson is born, is that there is a woman, the wife of Manoah, who is barren, unable to bear children. My suspicion is that most of us would read that line and just keep right on going, with absolutely no synapses beginning to fire away inside of our brains. But if you are a savvy reader of Scripture, and you read that some woman is barren, your antennae should begin just doing something like this. Why?
Because it always leads to a story that involves how they get pregnant.
Yes, and who's involved in that pregnancy?
A miracle from God.
God is coming and visiting and changing everything through a barren woman. So when we read that Manoah's wife is barren, we should go, doing. I know what's getting ready to happen now. This terrible start to this story of the Philistines oppressing the Hebrews for 40 years is going to come to a sudden stop. Well, it doesn't quite happen that way, but God does involve God's self in the life of this couple who will then give birth to Samson, just like with Sarai and just like with Rebekah and just like with Hannah. And even though Mary is not barren, as with Mary later on in time as well. When we read Scripture, we ought to read it at the level, or at least be working toward reading it at the level where we're really paying attention to things like words. But we've kind of lost that ability, haven't we? I mean, watching TV has dumbed us down to just being morons. We don't understand what we read anymore. We really have to struggle with that. And I'm willing to, say TV is really a major part of the problem. And if you think I'm barking up the wrong tree, the writing that goes on for TV is so bad that when they tell a joke, they have to install a laugh track to help you understand it. You're supposed to laugh here. That's funny. And the movies do it too. If you are watching a movie, it's the music that alerts you to what's getting ready to happen or how to interpret what it is that you are seeing. And if you didn't have the soundtrack going on with it, the movie, I don't mean talking, but I mean the music side of the soundtrack, you wouldn't have a clue often what's really going on and how you should think about what you're seeing. I'm reminded that Garrison Keillor of Prairie Home Companion, do any of you remember listening to a Young Lutheran's Guide to the Orchestra that he did? He did this long years before Prairie Home Companion, as I recall. It's a fascinating way to learn your instruments, as well as get a sense of what's going on. And so, for instance, as a good Lutheran in producing this guide to young Lutherans for the orchestra, he warns young Lutherans that they need to make sure that they do not take up playing the oboe. Because in the movies, anytime the oboe begins to play, a woman, the female protagonist, is about to lose all of her clothes. The one exception to that is that if the oboe is playing and a guy is smoking a cigarette, there's a baby about to be born. But for the young Lutherans, it's either get your the remote out to fast forward or get out of the room for a couple of minutes, because there's going to be some nudity getting ready to happen. Cellos. He talks about cellos as well, but that doesn't link with any kind of plot thing going on. That just is an indication that the director was short on funds. Well, okay, so the angel of the Lord tells Manoah's wife, who's never named in this particular story, that she's about to have a child. She's going to be visited and she's going to have a child. And she is herself to not touch alcohol or wine of any sort, avoid grapes of any stripe, and her son as well. He's never to touch wine. He's never to have a razor put on his head. He is to be raised as a Nazirite. And if you remember back in the book of Numbers, it tells all those various things. Can't even eat raisins. Can't even walk through a vineyard if you are a Nazirite, because you are on a special mission to and for God during the time that you are a Nazirite. But Samson is going to be a Nazirite not for a period of time, but for his lifetime. He's one of 3 men in Scripture that are lifelong Nazirites. Can you think of the other 2? To help you out, one's Old Testament and one is New Testament. And to help you out even more with the Old Testament guy, I've already mentioned his name.
Samuel?
Samuel, yeah. Now, it doesn't actually say that in our Old Testaments, but there are Dead Sea Scroll versions of 1 Samuel that call him a Nazirite. But the New Testament guy, it does say that about him. If you need a hint, it's in the Gospel of Luke. It's in chapter 1. It's in verse 15. Starts with a J.
Either John or Jesus.
John the Baptist, yeah.
Oh, sure.
Not Jesus, he turned water into wine, but John the Baptist is a lifelong Nazarite. The last one that's mentioned in Scripture. No, that's not true. Lifelong, he's the last one mentioned in Scripture. There actually is an important character in the New Testament who was a short-term Nazarite. It actually gets him killed. No, not Jesus. The other guy that gets killed. Paul. Apostle Paul is a Nazarite as well. He doesn't really get what she's trying to tell him, which reminded me of this old video. It swaps genders, but I thought this was pretty good. This is, he's going to refer to his wife this way, but think about Manoah the man. It doesn't help if...
Answers to. Great example of this. 6, 7 months ago, I get a text one day. The text said, questions the men have answers to. Great example of this. 6, 7 months ago, I get a text one day. The text says, please pray for Tom. He was in a bad wreck. I walk into the kitchen where my wife is. I said, hey, I just got a text that said, please pray for Tom. He was in a bad wreck. She said, was he driving? I said, I don't know. I just got a text that said, please pray for Tom. He was in a bad wreck. Were Carol and the kids in the car with him? I don't know. I just got a text that said, please pray for Tom. He was in a bad wreck. Were the people in the other car hurt? I don't know. I just got a text that said, please pray for Tom. He was in a bad wreck. What hospital did they take him to? I don't know. I just got a text that said, please pray for Tom. He was in a bad wreck. She said, well, you don't know anything. What do you know? I know you need to pray for Tom. I just got a text that said he was in a bad wreck.
That's Manoah. She tries to explain to him what the angel of the Lord has said, and he's just oblivious. And so he prays. At least in his obliviousness, he prays, God, please send that angel again. So, and when you send him, make sure that I get there, and be sure to also include some child rearing rules, because we haven't had any kids yet. We're going to need some help if we're going to raise this kid as a Nazarite. So sure enough, God in God's mercy responds to that prayer affirmatively. The angel shows back up, not to Manoah, but to the wife out in the field. She says, wait just a minute. The angel stays right where he is. She runs back in, gets her husband Manoah. They both come back out and listen to the angel of the Lord explain now a second time. Manoah stops him and asks a bunch of questions. And the angel just looks at him and says, did you not listen to a word that your wife just told you? I've already explained all of that. Just listen to her, and you'll have all of the answers that you need. Well, he decides that he wants to verify this even further, and so he says, well, stay here just a bit. I will cook a goat for you so you can have a good meal, and we can talk about it some more. And the angel says, I'm really not interested in eating your food. If you want to cook a goat, offer it as a sacrifice to God. Don't give it to me. Well, what's your name? My name to you is unimportant. You don't need to know my name. This isn't about me. This is about what God is getting ready to do for you. So, in fact, he does go ahead and create this sacrifice, a burnt sacrifice, where he offers a goat to God, as well as a grain offering to God. And sure enough, in the middle of producing this sacrifice, the angel gets up off the ground and flies into the smoke that is ascending to God and disappears. At which point in time, daft Manoah goes berserk. We're going to die. We've just seen God. He's going to kill us all. And he's running around with his head about cut off. And his wife looks at him and says, "You're a moron. Stop. If God intended to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted your sacrifice. Either one of them. And he wouldn't have told us all of these things. Just get a grip. It's going to be okay." Apparently he does, because they then do have a child a few months later. And when she gives birth to this boy, she calls him Samson, which roughly, not just transliterated, but translated means sunny. Not S-O-N-N-Y, but S-U-N-N-Y. And so Samson is born, and he is in fact raised as a Nazirite. But in some ways, much more important than being a Nazirite, the scripture tells us that God's Spirit almost immediately begins to work on him and beat within him and pulsate within him. This guy is sort of God enthused from the get-go, which is really intriguing, because I think, as most of you probably know, the Spirit of God is not given to everybody in the old. That's a post-Pentecost experience. We take it for granted, I think. That opens up a can of worms, but we take it for granted today that everybody's got the Spirit. Not in the Old Testament, not pre-Pentecost. It's select individuals here or there whom the Spirit comes down into and inspires, inflames, pulsates within them to do particular works for God. They most of the time, they don't get the Spirit and keep it forever. They have the Spirit for a set thing, and then they don't have the Spirit beyond that until the Spirit comes again to raise them up for something. But God, through the Spirit, seems to inhabit Samson in some amazing ways. Stepping back from Samson and his immediate family, we've just been told, as this book is starting out, that the Hebrews have decided once again to do evil. And God has delivered them to the Philistines. And now we've heard that God has come in a special way to this individual to raise him up, to deliver, to begin to, it says specifically, to begin to deliver the Hebrews from the Philistines. God, once again, in God's graciousness, has come to a people who really weren't very interested in God. That doesn't give us license to blow off God, but it does, I think, give us hope that sometimes despite us, sometimes in spite of us, God will come to us. It really is a word of hope for people who are struggling to do what they should be doing. God comes because we need that help. Thank goodness God does that. So as we finish out this first chapter, you know, there are these inklings of, well, maybe we're not going to end on a bad note. Maybe Samson's going to be a cool guy. Just maybe. But alas, it's not going to be that way. Important line is that very last one. Which brings us to chapter 14. Timnah is a little village that's about 4 to 5 miles away from Sora, which is the little town in which Samson is raised. Now, Sora is west of Jerusalem, but still in the highlands, in at least the hills, if not the mountains, that are coming down that ridge line through the middle of the land of Israel. But it's on kind of the western edge of that. And you're going to notice that each of my titles to these things is down to. And that's literally, because he's up in the hills, and to go anywhere, he's got to go down to wherever. So Timnah is down in the kind of in a valley about 4 to 5 miles away. Keep that in mind, because all through this chapter and part of the next, where Samson grows up at is only 4 to 5 miles away. Pretty close. For some perspective, if you were to walk out of here, turn right, and go to Don Tyson, and hang a left, when you get to Highway 265, whatever they call that there, Old Missouri or crossover, whatever, that's about 4 miles. And if you were to turn right, 5 miles is before you get to the Botanical Gardens. That's how close this area is. Just kind of keep that in mind. So we're still in the midst of all of this Philistine oppression. It's not violent, it's just cultural. And here, I think a good way to sort of get a sense of what the Philistine culture, the impact it had on the Hebrews, is just think about the impact of American culture internationally, where everybody wants hamburgers and everybody wants whatever. The Philistines exercised that kind of cultural hegemony, control over the Hebrews, where all the Philistine brands are the good brands. I don't know enough about brands to make a fool of myself telling you something, but the Gucciizing of what's important. Okay, so that's the background. The last we heard about Samson, God's Spirit is inhabiting him. Next thing we hear about Samson is this chapter is opening up, is him telling his parents, there's a woman down in Timnah, I want her, get her for me. Well, if you need a sense of how far we are removed from biblical understandings of honoring and respecting one's parents, he hasn't asked his parents whether this is a wise thing or a good thing. He hasn't addressed them to think about any of this. He has simply barked at them, ordered them, commanded them, there's a woman I want, get her for me. There's absolutely no parental respect, no parental authority going on in this family. Apparently, mom and dad didn't do a very good job of listening to the angel of the Lord with those child rearing hints that he offered. She is right in my eyes, he says. And that opens up a window onto a phrase that we're going to see over and over for the rest of the book of Judges. Samson, as well as other characters, are not interested in what is right in the eyes of God. He and they are interested in what is right in my eyes. What is it that pleases me? Not what is it that pleases God. It really is important as important as it is for us, that first question, it really is important to ask the second one. What is it that pleases God? And then, at some level, hopefully we begin to kind of think, well, if that's what pleases God, maybe I should move in that direction. Samson never does. It's all about Samson. It's all about Samson's desires, what is right in his eyes. Well, his parents try to talk some sense into him. Why do you want a Philistine girl when there's all these, you've got cousins, you've got people in town. Why? Because she's right in my eyes, he says. Get her for me. Well, so his parents do decide that they'll try to help out. Here's a nice map that gives you a sense of how all this is connected. There's Jerusalem. Right here is where Samson is living, and here's Timnah, just kind of down the hill, just a little ways. These are Philistine major towns. So the parents decide, well, if we can't talk him out of going after this woman, we will at least accompany him to Timnah and try to exert some pressure once we are there. So they all head down the 4 or 5 miles to Timnah. Well, along the way, somehow or other, they get slightly separated. Now, who separates from whom, the story doesn't tell us. But the parents keep going toward Timnah. But Samson, I'm going to say he diverts slightly to go through a vineyard. I've already said, being a Nazirite, that's a no-no. There are grapes in a vineyard. All the wine and raisin things, you can't even walk through a vineyard. Well, he goes to a vineyard. His parents either sidestepped it to avoid it, or he sidestepped to go through it. Whichever way, we don't know. But when he gets into the vineyard, and I'll let you make up your own mind why this happens, but he no sooner gets into the vineyard than a ravening lion runs at him, attacks him. Well, God is wanting to use Samson, so God's Spirit comes upon him right at this moment and empowers him in a special way, and he tears the lion limb to limb, throws him to the side. Doesn't tell anybody that he kills the lion, he just kills the lion. And then at some point gets back in with his parents, and they get down to Timnah, and once they get there, it looks like this wedding is going to happen. He's going to wed this woman. But before I go on with that story, the book of Numbers gave directions on what happens if you are a Nazirite and something occurs that shouldn't have happened. I.e., if you're a Nazirite, you can't be around death. Well, it's not just people death, animal deaths too. So he's just had contact with a dead lion. That's a no-no if you're a Nazirite. He's also in the middle of a vineyard. A no-no if you're a Nazirite. So there are rules. If this happens, then you need to go to the priest, get your hair, cut all your hair off so that you can show that, okay, the covenant has gotten broken. I may not have done it on purpose, but it's broken. We need to, and give a sacrifice and start all over. Well, he's not about, he's heading to Timnah to get married. He's not going to wait several weeks or months to be able to get with his bride-to-be. He doesn't care about his Nazirite vows, doesn't do any sacrificing, doesn't get his hair cut off. He just heads on like nothing out of the ordinary has occurred. And so he gets down to Timnah so that he can wed his wife. I want you to notice that in this old drawing, Samson doesn't look like Schwarzenegger. I don't know of any drawings today of Samson that don't have him looking like Schwarzenegger. I'm going to suggest that he did not look like Schwarzenegger. He looks more like you and me, which is what would befuddle people then, to see him suddenly so outrageously strong. If he looked like Schwarzenegger, that wouldn't baffle anyone. It's because he doesn't that it does. All right. So on his way, they head back home to get ready for the wedding, and now they're heading back down to Timnah for the wedding. And what do you know? He decides when he gets to the vineyard to once again enter the vineyard because he's kind of curious. What happened to that lion I killed? And when he sees the dead carcass, the carcass of the lion, there's a bunch of bees that have made a hive inside the carcass of this lion. And there's honey oozing out. And so he dips his hand in and gets a bunch of the honeycomb and is munching on the honey as he heads on down the hill to Timnah. And he, not telling his parents where it came from, gives his parents some of the honey too. He doesn't want to just be insensitive to God himself. He involves them in his evil. Unbeknownst to them, but he involves them as well. Well, that's pretty true to life, isn't it? I want to involve you in my evil. I want to make you just as guilty as me if I can along the way. So once he gets there, it just gets worse. This Nazarite decides to throw a stag party for all of the groomsmen that will be with him. There are 30 groomsmen that are lined up to help him in this particular wedding. And, they've got the wine going everywhere at this particular point. And the first thing that he does as the stag party begins is he tells a riddle. He introduces the riddle by saying, tell you what, if you can answer my riddle, I will give each of you 30 men a special set of clothes. But if you can't answer my riddle, you each have to give me a special set of clothes. So he's got the possibility of getting 30 sets of clothes, whereas they only get one. But the riddle that he tells is a very unfair riddle. If you are a Tolkien fan, think The Hobbit. Think Bilbo down in the Goblin Cave when he comes across Gollum. And they're exchanging riddles back and forth. And neither can stump the other. And Bilbo, at this point, thrusts his hands into his coat jacket, and his hand hits the ring that he has found a little bit earlier. And out loud he says, what do I have in my pocket? And Gollum hears him and immediately shrieks and says, unfair, unfair, that's not a fair riddle. But Bilbo, not even meaning it to be a riddle, says, oh, well, yes, you do have to answer it. And there's a terribly unfair riddle sparks the rest of what happens in Tolkien's books, which I won't spoil if you haven't read them. But his riddle, too, is unfair. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. Well, they immediately know there's no way they can answer that, but they've already agreed to 30 sets of clothes for him if they can't. Well, their only chance at this point is to work through his soon-to-be spouse. So they begin telling her, you need to get the answer from me. You didn't bring us here to cause us to all become poor, getting a set of clothes for him. You need to help us out. Well, so and they also have a threat involved. If you don't help us out, we will kill you. So she has some incentive to go to Samson and get the answer. So she does what, forgive me for saying this, but she does what women do. She goes and starts crying. You don't love me. you the way you're acting, blah 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 blah. And yeah, I know, but it's the biblical story. I'm just interpreting it for you. She cries and she begs and she weeps. And this goes on for days, for 7 days. And I think by this point in time, Samson's probably beginning to second guess what he's engaged in here, but he doesn't leave. She doesn't either, and she keeps crying. And finally, just the night before the 7th day, when they have to have an answer, he finally capitulates and says, "Oh, good heavens." And he gives her the answer. And she immediately leaves him and goes to the 30 groomsmen and gives the answer. And then the 30 groomsmen come back to Samson and say, "Ah, it is a lion, and it is honey." And he knows that he has just been betrayed by his soon-to-be spouse. It irritates the snot out of him. And so he tells the 30 groomsmen that he knows what they have just done. But he doesn't renege. He goes down to Ashkelon, that town that was about 25 miles south, and he kills 30 Philistines, strips them of their clothes, gathers them all up, and comes back and gives them to the 30 groomsmen. So he did what he said he would do. If they got the answer, he would pay them off. So he pays them off, but he's still angry as all get out. And so he just goes home to Mom and Daddy's house, leaves his wife, or soon-to-be wife, with her dad, and he goes home. He abandons her. Well, a couple of things that are maybe important here. Just because God empowers somebody with God's Spirit doesn't necessarily mean that that person is righteous and good to begin with. We might think it does, and perhaps it should, as we think about such stuff, but God does use people that have nothing to do with God. And thank goodness God does. There are good things that happen in our world, not because the church is on the avant-garde side of getting it done. We're often at the back end trying to catch up, but God is moving through somebody to have God's will done, and hopefully the church will sooner or later catch up and become a part of it as well. Which means God can accomplish God's will whether we help God or not. God doesn't really need us, is the other way of saying that, to accomplish God's will. I'm sorry to Vanita to have to say this, but St. Teresa says, God has no hands but your hands. Blah, 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 blah. Well, that works for a mystic, but it's not true for the rest of us. God doesn't need our hands. God will use our hands, but God doesn't need our hands, or our feet, or our hearts, or our eyes, or any other parts of our anatomy. God is happy to receive us, but God doesn't need us to accomplish God's will, unless we're a mystic, and then it makes good sense. So, chapter 15 opens up. Samson is now beginning to rethink his choice to run home to Mommy and Daddy, and wants to get his wife after all. And so he sets off now another time from Sora down to Timnah, now to get his wife. And to make up for having abandoned her at the time of his wedding, he brings along with him a goat. If this were today, he's bringing along a box of chocolates and some roses. But this is 1000 plus BC. He's bringing a goat so he can cook a goat for his wife. When he gets to her home, his father-in-law says, "Oh, but you can't come in. Oh, but she is not here. I thought you abandoned her. I thought you hated her. And so I gave her to one of the groomsmen. She's his wife." Well, it really ticks Samson off. But just before I get into that piece of the story, let me say a word here. The father-in-law says, I thought you hated her. And I want to jump from that to the place in Malachi as well as the place in Romans where God is speaking and God says, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. And we get all distraught that God would hate. Okay, I get that. But words have multiple meanings. Meanings that aren't necessarily clear on the front end. Hate doesn't always mean hate. And this phrase by the father-in-law helps us begin to get a sense of a broader understanding of what hate means. I thought you hated her, so I gave her to a groomsman. I thought you had abandoned her. I thought you had divorced her. I thought you didn't care about her. Esau doesn't fit into the ultimate covenant picture. Jacob becomes the chosen one. He's the one of choice, not Esau. So, Jacob have I loved. I choose Jacob, but I don't choose Esau. I'm going to ignore him when it comes to covenant. I'm going to just let him go his own way. That's what the father thinks that Samson has done to his daughter. But I can make it up for you. She's got a younger daughter, and she's really cute. You'll like her. And Samson's not interested. He, in fact, says, well, now I've really got an excuse to be angry at you Philistines. And he goes out, and he kills a bunch of groomsmen. Just destroys them. Which then, in turn, angers the Philistines, who are mad because he has killed some. And so they attack, and it's back and forth, this counterattacking that takes place where Samson is killing them, they're coming back and doing stuff. What the Philistines do, they can't kill Samson or any of his family, but what they can do is they kill his bride, who's now married to a groomsman, as well as her dad. They burn them up, they incinerate them in their house. Well, that makes Samson even more angry, so here's where he now goes out and finds a bunch of foxes, 300 foxes. And there our antennae should be zooming up again, because it wasn't just a few chapters back we ran across the number 300, you remember? Some of you weren't here, you're excused for not knowing. Gideon starts off with 32,000 soldiers. Anybody who's afraid can leave, so there's only 10,000. And then the 10,000, 9,700 of them can't drink water correctly out of the stream. Only 300 can. 300. God can use 300 to accomplish God's will. Samson can use 300 foxes to accomplish what he wants. And so he ties them into pairs, puts a torch behind them, lights the torch, and sends them running into the wheat fields. It's wheat harvest time. So it's about what we would call Pentecost. It's May, June. And the fields are burned up. And the orchards are burned up. And the vineyards are burned up. And that ticks off the Philistines even more, because now they've lost any way to be able to eat for the next several months. And so they decide that they are going to get Samson once and for all. But he runs off and hides in a cave. Philistines show up to get him. And they run into a group of 3,000 Judahites, 3,000 people that are Jewish soldiers in the vicinity. And they say, we want Samson. Why? Because he did such and such. And the Judahites say, well, wait just here. They know where he's hiding, so they go down to where he's hiding in a cave and say, you need to come with us. And he says, why? Well, they explain it. And he says, well, I will let you tie me and take me to them, but only if you won't be the ones who kill me. We won't kill you. We're just going to hand you off to the Philistines. And he says, fine, you may tie me. And so they tie him up and bring him then to the Philistines, who, when the Philistines see him coming, all begin to shout and hooray, and they're just excited. But as soon as they begin to shout, the Spirit of the Lord again empowers him, and he breaks the ropes that are tying him, and he looks down and he sees a donkey carcass that hasn't yet rotted entirely, and he strips the donkey of its jawbone, and he kills 1,000 Philistines. And this big heap of Philistines is a hill by this point, and it becomes known as Jawbone Hill. Once again, he's involved in death, an animal. He's got a jawbone of a donkey that hadn't rotted yet that he's used to kill these guys. But he does kill them all off, and when he's done, he makes a song about it that's all about what he did, all the wonderful things that he just got through accomplishing. And he then tells God, I'm thirsty. This was hard work. And God makes a spring spout up right there by Jawbone Hill that he's able to get something to drink from. And the chapter ends up telling us that for 20 years, Samson led the Judahites. Doesn't say a word about peace, doesn't say a word about rest. It just says he led them. 40 years of oppression from the Philistines is ongoing. Samson, just in his own little self-absorbed community, is doing some leading. Which gets us to the one story that you probably do know about Samson, that when we were younger, they made a song about. Samson and Delilah. Okay, so this chapter starts off by saying that somewhere toward the end of this 20 years of leading that Samson has been involved in, he's still not married, so he decides that he's going to go spend a night with a prostitute. So he goes and spends a night with a prostitute. Folks in town go, ooh, we've got a chance now to get him, but let's wait till morning. Thing is, he gets up in the middle of the night, and he's not there in the morning when they come. So he once again gets away from them. But when he leaves, just to prove to them that he knows what he's up to and they can't touch him, when he gets to the gates of the city, he rips the gates from off the city wall completely. Not just a piece of the gate, he rips the entirety of the gates out of the wall, hefts them up over his head. This is a mosaic at the Jewish synagogue of Hukkok, a little bit west of the Sea of Galilee. It's the earliest rendition that we know of, where he's carrying the city gates above his head. He carries them all the way to Hebron. That's 35 miles. And it's uphill, both ways. Carries this gate over his head, 35 miles, and then finally throws them down in Hebron to prove that he can do as he pleases. There's a whole lot to be said about Hebron, but I won't go there. Then, he's still not satisfied. He discovers a woman, now much closer to home, in the valley of Sorek, so it's kind of close to where the wife that he didn't get to have lived. He falls in love with Delilah. Contrary to the way we typically think about this, Delilah is not a prostitute. The story about the prostitute was the first couple verses. That tale is finished. Now we're on to Delilah. She is simply a woman he falls in love with. when the leaders of the Philistines, the king, if you will, the mayor of each of those 5 towns, learns that Samson is romantically engaged with Delilah, they come to Delilah with a contractual offer. Each one of us will give you 1,100 silver shekels if you will figure out what gives Samson his strength. That's 5,500 silver shekels that she can get if she can accomplish what they want. For perspective, Judas will betray Jesus for 30. She's about to get 5,500 if she rats on Samson. So to just jump to it, she does precisely what the wife did. She starts hitting him up for what makes him so strong. And Samson is playing cat and mouse with her. He's toying with her. Well, you know, if you tie me up with catgut, with some kind of animal sinews, I'll lose my strength. So she ties him up with animal sinews and says, Samson, Philistines are coming. And the sinews just immediately pop and break off. You lied to me. What really makes you lose your strength? Well, if you tie me up with new ropes, then I'll lose my... So she does it, same thing, Heather. Well, if you tie me up, my 7 braids of my hair, if you tie me up in the loom where you're working, I'll lose my... you lied to me. So finally, after this has gone on for a very long time, he finally tires of it and tells her, you cut my hair. She realizes at that moment that he's been honest with her, and so she has them come in one more time while he's sleeping on her lap. They cut the braids off. She once again screams, and he, not knowing that the spirit has departed him, thinks that he's going to be able to get away, but the spirit has left him. He has no strength. They capture him. They gouge out his eyeballs, making him blind. They enslave him. And he then spends the rest of his life, almost, milling grain. But this little section ends with a line that has the music changed to alert you that something's happening. The line says, but his hair began to grow back. So here's the end of Samson. All of the assembled Philistine rulers have arrived at Gaza, the main capital. They are at the temple of Dagon, their god, the god of grain, and they're having festivities. And they're telling about how they've captured Samson, blah, blah. And so somebody calls for Samson, bring him out here to entertain us. Have him do a 2-step or something. And he comes out, and in a break where somebody begins to give a speech or whatever, he's set to the side for a moment, and the little servant boy who has brought him out in all of his blindness to perform for all these people, all of the rulers, as well as 3,000 Philistines that are on top of the temple watching and hurrahing and so on. He tells the servant boy, I'm tired, can you help me lean against one of the pillars? And the little servant boy, not thinking, puts him against the pillars, and Samson prays, God, one more time, in your mercy, give me strength. Not so that your will could be done, blah, 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 so that I can avenge my gouged out eyeballs. And God gives him strength, and he pushes the pillars apart, and it all crashes down, and all of the Philistine rulers are killed, along with 3,000. And the story tells us that Samson accomplished more in death than he ever did in his life. I'm going to hope that that's not the story of you, that that's not what gets put on your grave marker. You accomplished more in death than you ever did in your long life. The story ends with his parents, well, not his parents, but his other family members. They go down to Gaza, they retrieve his body, and they bring him up to bury him with the family in the family tomb. Norman Rockwell did the painting on the left, incidentally. He wasn't a very good theologian or historian. They didn't have that kind of chains to be able to put on people at this particular moment in time. Here's where Samson's story ends, and I think this is a wonderful way to conclude it. If somebody as worthless as Samson could end up appearing in Hebrews 11 as a person of faith, there's hope for you and me. Next week we'll look at Judges chapter 17 and 18. You may want to read it before you show up. And we'll see you next week.